Hi, today I'll be reviewing AP World Unit 6, Consequences of Imperialism. So let's get started. So just before we get started, a disclaimer, and I just want to let everyone know that the content in this video is created in order to inform, educate, and prepare people for the AP exam. But whatever I said does not reflect my personal opinions and is meant to educate and inform. It's not, I do not wish to cause any form of tensions in the comments below or cause any issues, and I can empathize with what happened due to the and this topic is pretty fragile with what's being covered. So if anyone doesn't has any ideas or ways to make it better, then please put in the comments below. So let's get started. So 6.1, rationales for imperialism. So what is imperialism? And imperialism is basically the process of extending power and influence of a country through force. And there are many reasons for starting that were created, or justifications that were created for starting imperialism against other countries. And frankly, all of them are a word that frankly I shouldn't use in polite society. So let's just leave it at that. So let's go through some of those justifications. So the first one, what you have is nationalism. And so let's go see two areas. So in England, England basically lost its American colonies at the end of the Revolutionary War, and they looked for new lands to open settlements in. And so that basically they wanted more territory. And in Japan, they had nationalistic pride caused by the Meiji Restoration, which basically was exerted by invading Korea and then invading China, and then so on and so forth. Along with that, you have cultural and religious motives for imperialism. And one thing you have is the white man's burden, which basically thought that white men were basically able to civilize the brutes. And it basically was a rationale of saying, oh, these people can't help themselves. Look at how undignified and how uncivilized they are. And we can go civilize them, and we can go make them better and turn them into pseudo versions of us who won't be accepted into society, but then it'll be fun to watch them become better members of society. And frankly, it was bad form of thinking, bad form of just I don't understand their ways of thinking, honestly. So you also had scientific justifications for this with pseudoscience such as social Darwinism, which basically was using Darwin's ideas of evolution and basically turning it into showing that some races or some ethnic groups are less superior than others, with the white men or white woman being at the top while you have everyone else lower and lower. And again, not smart. And the thing is, Darwin himself did not advocate for such things. He argued against it. However, people basically use such justifications in order to fund and promote their ideologies. And along with that, you had the ideology of Europeans were just better than others, which again, not true. And you also had religion, in which missionaries wanted people to convert. And this was also a prime factor of causing imperialism. And like with Christopher Columbus going to the islands and going to those islands in North America, you had missionaries come with him, and you had missionaries come to other territories in order to gain more followers in those territories. And frankly, not all of those missionaries were bad people. Some people worked to end the illegal slave trade. Some people provided imported medicines and medical care, and some set up schools for instruction in religion and subjects such as math, science, and basically work to improve the quality of life, and that's honestly a good thing. And the thing is, with even though you had all of these reasons, none of them are actually true. So many historians and many people think that like the main reason for doing so is an economic reason, or being able to gain materials that those areas and territories in Africa or Asia had that Europe did not have. And all of this was basically just used as a way to justify it in their heads and justify it to people who are against it. So yeah, that's pretty much rationales for imperialism. So now let's go on to state expansion. So the thing with state expansion is you have basically England and France and the Dutch and Spain, and those you also had Portugal, I believe, and those are the main countries. You also had Germany, like pretty much most of Europe doing it. And so one major area to look at was Africa. And the thing with Africa is Europe had a long-standing relationship with them due to the slave trade, which had been going on for almost 2 centuries ago. And so Africa had a lot of natural resources such as gold, ivory, palm oil, diamonds, etc. And so the thing with in Africa is that they were most European countries were restricted in getting into Africa, like getting into the more innermost parts due to restrictions by the tribes that were there. But then there were a few exceptions, such as the French seizing Algeria, Dutch immigrants living in South America, and British colonists. And basically what happened was that both of the Europeans had better technology due to the rise of gunpowder empires. And with these gunpowder weapons, you had the rise of much more devastating weaponry that the Europeans had rather than the people in Africa or in the other territories. And the thing is, what the Europeans would do is they would trade and they would give some of their older technology off, which although the people in Africa had guns, they were still like you had to reload after firing a single shot, while the British or the other Europeans had like semi-automatic weaponry, or you just had to pull the trigger. Well, what would you call it? I'm not sure. The reloading system back, and then you have to shoot, and it's much more faster than having to jam in the bullet again and then pew. So they basically had better technology, and they also had medicine, and with the better technology, they also could peacefully convert people and they could get more territory by just having goodwill with the people. And that's one way they did it. However, they also had diplomacy with basically they worked with the rulers of those territories in order to get like resources. However, most of these agreements and treaties were not kept, and they basically broke their promises and they took them out. And this just happened over time again and again. And so it was basically a massacre. And so one example of this is Egypt with the Suez Canal, which was created in a way to, in order to get ships across the Mediterranean easier. And so with this, you have so much European powers going into Africa and other places in Africa and the Middle East. So what you had is you had the Berlin Conference in Germany. And the thing with Germany is that the rule of Germany at that time, the Otto von Bismarck, he had no interest in colonies. So he did want to keep the peace, however. So he basically created borders. He basically had the European countries create borders for the colonization, basically saying that you can't go past X area, Y area. And the thing is that these borders were created based on territorial needs of the colonies, of the colonists. And so what happened afterwards is that after independence was gained in the 1900s, 1900s, late 20th century or mid 20th century after World War II, national unity was difficult due to different ethnic backgrounds within those territories, which were basically, and those resentments were basically increased with the colonists who want to keep any form of resistance under control by basically making no one trust each other. And these resentments and basically distrusts increased by the time it happened, and it led to boiling points, such as and led to massacres, as shown with the Rwandan massacre with the Tutsis and the Hutus. And along with that, you have the Boer Wars, which were basically created concentration camps. And in these camps, medical care and sanitation were very poor, and food rations were so little that many of the people died of starvation. There were activists that tried to improve the lives of these refugees. However, only the white camps received attention, while the conditions in black camps remained terrible. And of the 100,000 blacks interned in those concentration camps, nearly 15,000 of those people perished, sadly. And along with that, you had the Congo, which had just terrible conditions. And basically, you had the Belgian colonizers basically abusing their power in order to strip mine the Congo for resources. And this again is like an example of how the colonizers had overreached their power, and that led to both resentment and difficulties that still reside to this day. And so you also go into South Asia. And before we do that, just this picture in the Congo of King Leopold of Belgium. And basically what he did is that he authorized people who don't meet their quotas in the Congo to have their hands cut off, which seems horrifyingly painful. Like I don't know what causes humans to do such things. So yeah. And you basically have South Asia. So what happened in South Asia is that basically with the end of the 7 Years' War, France lost many of its territories in South Asia where they were kind of prominent. And so England basically gained a foothold in places like India. And so they created the East India Company, which basically encroached on the land of the weak Mughal Empire. And basically they managed to control the entire Indian subcontinent by I believe the late 1700s, early 1800s. So now let's move on to China. So the thing with China is that they suffered many humiliations in the early 1800s. And so what happened was that European nations carved out spheres of influence within China, which they had exclusive trading rights and access to natural resources. And this, along with the weakening of the Qing government, basically led to a lot of internal troubles and led to a lot of resentment within the people. And you now had the Empress Cixi, who basically had a hatred of foreigners and reforms, which may have helped the Chinese people and the Chinese government last longer. She basically asked for, well, not asked, she basically ordered that all foreigners be killed. And this, along with the rising resentment against the Europeans and people who took foreign ideas, this led to the Boxer Rebellion, which again, once the Europeans saw, they took control of the situation a lot more and eroded Chinese sovereignty. And this continued on and on with the Chinese Nationalist Party being created and becoming a republic, and then becoming Japanese territories, and then so on and so forth, until the Chinese Communist Party took control and basically regained some balance of sovereignty for China. However, this internally did not last, as you'll hear more later on. And along with that, for state expansion, Japan was a main supporter of this, with Japan not having much resources. So what they had to do is that they had a large military. And what do you do when you have no resources and a large military? You go invade some people who have no way to fend for themselves in order to gain more stuff. So that's what they did. It's like the clear textbook of imperialism. And you also have the Dutch in the Dutch East Indies. And the Dutch, the French, and the British in the East Indies, basically they produce cash crops. And these cash crops allowed for money to be spent for leisure products, along with necessary tools such as palm oil, rubber, cotton, and so on and so forth. Now let's move on to the United States. I just one sec, need some water. So the United States was basically taking land from indigenous peoples. And what they had an idea was they believed they had a manifest destiny or a natural and inevitable right to expand to the Pacific Ocean. And so this basically, along with this, you basically had expansion overseas in places such as Guam, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines. And this was caused by the Spanish-American War between the United States and, well, Spain. And so this all happened in the uh, late 1800s, and so as it turns out, all of these territories came in the early 1900s due to colonialism. And finally, yeah, Russia, which basically there's not much to say too much about Russia, but then the thing is, Russia and Britain had a rival. Sorry, my apologies. So Russia and England, they had a basically a competition in order to dominate Afghanistan. And this rivalry was basically known as the Great Game. And so that's basically it for Russia. So now let's move on to 6.3. So indigenous responses to state expansion. So like I talked about in Unit 5, the Balkans had like a rise in nationalism. And these movements continued on, and it led to independence in many of those countries, such as Greece and Serbia. And in the United States and most of the Americas, what you had is you basically had a lot of resistance against imperialism and aggression against those territories. So one example of this is the Cherokee Nation. So the Cherokees were basically assimilated into white settler culture, and they adopted colonial methods of farming, weaving, building, and they even created a alphabet for their own language. And within a short time, their tribe was basically literate, and the Cherokee Phoenix was the first Native American newspaper in the U.S. But this assimilation into the culture of the people in the United States did not save the Cherokee Nation from greed. And so after gold was found in where they lived, they were forced to move away, and it basically caused them to relocate to now what is Oklahoma. And along with that, in the northwestern United States, you had people, well, you had like the Native Americans thinking of this idea called ghost dancing, which basically were rituals of dances and songs which were meant to drive out the whites and restore the lands and traditions of the Native Americans. And although they thought it would work, it again was rooted not in scientific thought. And I don't mean to be patronizing, it just didn't work based on what happened right now. And so, yeah, and now let's go into South Asia. So what happened in South Asia was that you basically had in India, you had the British Raj taking over most of India by 1857. And so due to this and due to a lot of inequality in the area, you had the creation of the Indian National Congress, which basically by the 1940s led to the end of British rule in India. Now you also have Vietnam and the Philippines, in which in Vietnam you had resistance against colonial rule, and in the Philippines you had wars against both the Spanish along with wars against the Americans. However, both were oppressed by the colonizers in the end, even though they led a valiant effort to fight. Now you also had resistance in places like Australia and New Zealand, with basically in Australia the the government told the settlers to treat the indigenous inhabitants kindly. However, the government did not recognize their land ownership, and due to this, they were not protected by law. So many people were killed as they were trying to defend their territory. And in New Zealand, basically, what happened was that the Maori were losing their land, even though the British claimed that they would have their land protected. And they were already here, like the Aboriginal people were there for 50,000 years. So it is their territory, but then it was taken away over time. And finally, you have Africa with Pan Africanism, which is basically an idea that all Africans had a shared identity and nationalism. However, this was also mainly, in a way, a Western idea, and this was mainly found in Western Africans. So let's go into global economic development at this time. So what you had at this time was you had a lot of technology being created, like I talked about in Unit 5. So in colonies, you had a lot of railroads, steamships, and telegraphs. And the thing with this is that they allowed for the colonizers to increase their logistical output and just make things more efficient in their colonies. And although this may have helped the colonized or the people who were colonized, it was mainly created as a way for the colonizers to strip mine the territories that they gained. And so along with that, you had the colonists using the colonizers using the people's area for cash crops such as guano and rubber and palm oil and coffee. And so, yeah, and this also, you have like a list of raw materials as shown here, such as cotton, rubber, palm oil, minerals, diamonds, all of that. And so some global consequences of this was basically um, monocultures, or basically a lack of agricultural diversity in these developing nations. And this basically took its toll on both biodiversity and the climate, as people could not make the foods that they make the foods or make the crops that they need for survival due to having and basically making the stuff required for the colonizers. And it was also bad for the environment, as basically it's not increasing biodiversity. So yeah. 6.5, economic imperialism. So economic imperialism is also a form of imperialism, but you have basically, instead of having a country do it, you have companies do it. And basically it's when foreign businesses have economic power and influence in a country in that can't fend for itself. So in Asia, some examples of this are the East India companies. And with China, you basically had companies sending opium into China in order to get the Chinese people addicted so they can make more money. And so this again, after the opium ships were destroyed, this led to the British government getting involved and basically humiliating China in the 100 years of humiliation. And this also led to the spheres of influence, where there were lots of trading area for those companies. Some other examples of economic imperialists are like the Plantation Syndicate and De Beers Diamonds. And these two were created in order to basically strip mine African resources using the people in those territories. And in Latin America, you had US involvement with US companies basically like funding the development of those Latin American countries. And they basically had like a huge say in these Latin American countries such as Argentina, Chile, Brazil, and like the islands such as Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and so on and so forth. 6.6, causes of migration in an interconnected world. So the thing is, migration was basically increasing by that point due to increased labor systems in which workers migrate to new places. And the reasons for this are due to slavery, indentured servitude, contract workers, or penal colonies. And so some people did this in order for those reasons, as they could then get money for their family in other countries because they don't have jobs here. They could be contract workers, or they're prisoners who are instead going to do hard labor as their sentence. Some people also moved to other countries and migrated in order to get a better life. And some examples of countries that did this, people in countries that did this, were in Ireland, China, and India. And so this picture is the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States. And this was mainly built by Chinese immigrants from China who moved to the United States in the 1840s during the gold rush and then helped create it. Without them, without the 20,000 immigrants that helped create it, we wouldn't be, well, the West Coast wouldn't have been like it is today. And along with that, you have settler colonies, which have technical experts in X or Y thing, and it allows you to basically migrate to new areas where you can get better job offers. And that's shown today also. And some examples of this are also shown in basically Japan. In Japan, where they want to create a colonization society where they could export surplus population as well as commercial goods to other countries, but this was a failure. And yeah. So 6.7, effects of immigration. So some of the main effects in home countries where the people moved from is that it resulted in a change in gender roles. So the thing is, most of the people who moved were men. And so this led to basically greater autonomy for females, and it led to greater equality at that point because there were more females than males. And in receiving societies, you basically had ethnic enclaves, such as Chinese enclaves, Indian enclaves, Irish enclaves, so on and so forth. And now you can see those nowadays, such as Chinatown, and like you have, I'm not sure about, I haven't been to many of them. I've been to Chinatown, but then I'm not sure about the other ones. So you have all these enclaves in places like the United States, but then you also had basically a form of fear against the foreigners, or a form of resentment against these foreigners. And so this led to immigration regulation in places like the United States and Australia. So in the United States, they basically prevented Chinese immigration through basically regulations to the Chinese Exclusion Act, or which basically limited Chinese immigration into the United States. You also had the White Australia policy, which led to the Chinese Immigration Act, which limited the amount of Chinese people who could come to China. And the thing is, this actually still stayed until the mid 1970s, this White Australia policy. And so it just shows how long such a policy stayed on and how deep the roots of imperialism are today, and how close, how even though it was a long time back, it was still so close in the grand scheme of things. So I guess we can end that off with that note. And honestly, I hope everyone does well on the AP test, and I hope that you all stay safe. So thank you, and bye.